I drink coffee. You drink tea, my friend, as the song goes, right?
No, I drink coffee in the morning and
Oh,
tea the rest of the day.
right. You're in London.
Yeah.
So we are at it again. Now we are in English. I'll try my best to just sit quietly and ask questions from of Alexander Booth, a polemicist, a writer, 6 books under his belt in English. He speaks perfect Russian, which would be, I was thinking about it as a subject of one of the chapters we're going to cover today. Our the Russian language spoken by the people who spent here some time. And I think it's conserved a little bit. It kind of captures like in a moth in an amber. What do you think? What kind of period of your life it kind of captured your Russian? When did it stop evolving?
Well, to begin with, I do hope that your American viewers won't be put off by my British accent, and if they are, just tell them that this is how English sounds if it's pronounced properly.
Okay.
But
Americans are mesmerized by accents. We love accents.
but as to the Russian language, well, I left Russia when I was 25 years old,
Huh.
which was a rather long time ago, and I have spoken quite a bit of it in fits and starts since then, but not very much since I moved to Britain, which was 32 years ago. And so I'm perhaps not a good exemplar of the Russian language developing among people who left the country a long time ago. I mean, people in New York who typically revolve within Russian circles their whole lives are perhaps more indicative of what really happens. But I must say that whenever I read contemporary, I mean modern Russian publications and listen to people from Russia speak, I'm quite appalled by the number of English words and Anglicisms they use unnecessarily. I mean, there are certain words that simply didn't exist in Russian before. I mean, political vocabulary, a great deal of sociological vocabulary,
Legal is the like 50,
legal,
50% does not exist. The order of
yeah.
protection is
So
something.
that is fair enough. But when they say fakery
Oh,
when they're absolutely perfect Russian words, and I remember the first time I went to
this is
Russia.
fake news. Это
Yeah,
называется fake news.
well,
По-русски
exactly,
называется fake news. Вот.
and so on and
That's it. Yeah,
so forth. But I suppose
that's it.
immigrants who left Russia
Mhm.
many decades ago have always bitched about the corruption of the language, and since they left, I
So
do
we are
recall.
joining the line. Although I must tell you, so much borrowing was going on during the human history. Phoenician alphabet,
But
adopted
yes,
by Greeks, adopted by Slavs, adopted by Romans. Everybody was faking it till they were making it. So that's
well,
it's kind of
well,
it's part of a fascination with Russia because it's very fast to adopt things. I'm not defending, God forbid.
well, Russia adopts things very fast,
Yeah,
but not always the best things, unfortunately. For
especially in this
example,
century.
uh, well, yes. Well, if you start with, well, you don't start with that, but you can sort of focus on that. Marxism came obviously from the
That's right.
West,
Yeah.
and socialism did as well, and but even culturally, unfortunately, Russia began to borrow from the West, began to borrow from Western culture, its own culture, at a time when the West was really no longer there. I mean, had the Russians begun to borrow from the West, let's say in the 16th century, Russia would be a much better place now. But since the borrowing really started in the 18th, during the age of enlightenment, by that time the West was already, in my opinion, in decline. So I agree. Yes, there are borrowings. There are borrowings in culture. There are borrowings in art. There are borrowings in language, and there are developments in all those things. But I don't subscribe to the idea that every borrowing or development is for the better. In fact, my conservative temperament suggests that most of them are for the worse. So I've managed to fall out with just about every editor and every publisher I've come across, you know. So remember, for example, I lost a job.
So what did you say so bad about Putin and Russia?
Well, I said the truth. It's basically
Tell us the truth. We're not French. We're not on TV. We're just people who want to listen.
Well, it's an evil regime. It's a klepto-fascist regime, as I call it, with the klepto part being the operative one, because it's a unique state in the history of mankind that's formed by a fusion of secret police and organized crime, and the
mob ideology called communism.
Well, communism isn't part of it now. You see,
but it is. Ideologically, they are a single country. They're a society. They respect Lenin. They respect Stalin. They have the mausoleum to play with. That's still a big part in the psyche national.
But they don't bandy about communist ideology. They basically make money, and they create this massive propaganda machine based on the imperial greatness of Russia and Third Rome and Saint Russia, Holy Russia, and all that, as camouflage, as sort of as a self-legitimizing device.
Legerdemain, as they say in France.
Well, legerdemain, yeah, sleight of hand.
Yeah.
It's frankly evil. I mean, and of course the way the Putin regime tries to influence Western politics is by itself is just awful. I mean, it's every Western country has experienced some kind of barrage of trolls and electronic attacks in the run-up to elections, plus what I have already mentioned, that they keep finances parties like Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, and the National Front, which is not called National Front any longer, but it's in France, but that's the same thing, and so on and so forth. I mean, so I didn't say anything that hasn't been said by other people. But that
was enough to kind of.
Yeah. Well, no, I fell out with the mail for two reasons. I mean, first I was put on a warning, and the second time they got rid of me. The first time, when Boris Johnson was still the mayor of London, a homosexual pressure group created a campaign of ads on buses, and the message was just get, we are what we are, and so get used to it. I mean, that sort of thing. I don't remember the exact words.
Deal with that.
Yeah, something like that. But then a Christian, and of course the mayor allowed that. But then a Christian group wanted to run a counter campaign, more in line with their own view of the world, and the mayor blocked it. And so I wrote an article saying that, well, come on, chaps, fair is fair. What's sauce for the goose should be sauce for the gander.
Yeah.
and and anyway, there were we have this PCC, Press Complaint Commission. They received dozens of complaints.
So the press
Uh,
is so effective
uh, well,
in the UK.
they well, it's so ineffective because they received dozens of complaints and they acted on them, and I received hundreds
No.
of messages that were frankly scary. I mean, I don't scare very easily, but well, there were death threats
Right.
and all that. One message said, "I would kill you, but looking at your photograph, you don't have that long left to live anyway, so I won't bother." I mean, that sort of thing. But the mail didn't stand by me. Anyway, I was put on a warning, and then about a fortnight later, there was a scandal involving Princess Michael of Kent. Whose nickname is Princess Pushy.
Mm-hmm.
She was conducting a very open affair with the Russian mafioso,
Mm-hmm.
a young man actually, and they would check into in the Danieli and the suite of the Danieli in Venice, and they would be photographed walking around holding hands and all that. A very public affair, a member of the royal family. And then in the middle of it, he was riddled with bullets in the center of Moscow. He was shot dead.
Wow.
And there were all sorts of rumors suggesting that there were links between the Russian organized crime and Prince Michael of Kent. Who, anyway, I basically wrote a piece about it saying that if our royal family wishes for Britain to become a republic in the near future, this is exactly the way to behave. Now, the palace complained, and that was the end of it. But you see, things that happen to me don't really matter to anybody but me, and sometimes not even to me. But the papers in the West have very effective mechanisms of suppressing free speech. I mean, the mechanism, the force that activates the mechanism is not necessarily the government, as it was in the Soviet Union, but usually it's a fear of lawsuits. Every word you write has to go through a legal department, and the legal department rules, and a lot depends on who you write about. If the chap you write about is a doctor somewhere in the sticks, then you can get away with saying all sorts of things about him. If he's a billionaire who can afford a massive lawsuit that will tie you up in knots for months, then they'll just block it. I'm not comparing, of course, the situation in the West with that in the Soviet Union yet.
No.
But we're definitely moving in that direction. You can see how the development is vectored, and the vector points its arrow right at
No,
that.
it's a race to the bottom between the press being suicidal business wise. I mean, in the what's called first. I love this definition. First world countries, press is clearly suicidal. They don't publish anything resembling what interests the public or what's in interest of the countries, and the other side is. The advent of the electronics and Kindle and websites like news aggregators where you go and you don't have to basically read anything but the headlines on Drudge Report or other likewise similar websites, and every basically big internet company has their own news, like Yahoo News, the most detestable. And I mean, I try not to go lower than that, but occasionally I have to read stuff that kind of scandalous headline that caught my eye, so I go there. But Between those two forces that do not help actually to support this medium, which is so. When do you think the journalism started? I wanted to ask you. When do you call the birth of journalism? What century would that be?
Well, I would say, God, you got me there. There were newspapers in England in the 16th century already.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the by the but there were few. Well, I think by the 18th century, the network of newspapers grew, and the 19th century, that was the best time in the history of British journalism. But it's interesting what you said about the internet, because I worked in the advertising industry for 30 years, and both in America and in Britain. And I remember when I first moved to Britain from America, and I saw those posters, those hoardings, those huge ads. They took my breath away. Everything was extremely clever, witty, to the point, brilliantly written, and all that. Well, lots of long copy ads were.
And men were smoking, and women were smoking, and ironing, and men were kind of.
No, I'm not talking about 100 years ago. I'm talking about 30 years ago.
All right, no smoking already.
Yeah, those. Well, although I was quite amazed, by the way, comparing the two countries, I was quite amazed, because practically everybody smoked in those days. Now nobody.
Yeah, when I came here 25 years ago, I was kind of among the smokers. Yeah, I quit about 5 years.
Another thing that amazed me, because in New York, already that infamous 3 martini lunch was on the way out, and young people on the rise, young executives, never. They just they would go out and they order mineral water or something like that at lunch, or a cup of coffee. And then I went to England, and I was amazed that a lot of people didn't eat at lunch; they just drank. And that was amazing. But anyway, getting back on our subject, I talked to my friends who are still in advertising, and they're desperate because real advertising has gone out of the window. Everything is reduced to something that can fit on a pencil or on a 5-second bite on the internet.
That's right.
And it's just gone. But it's how shall I put it? Advertising is not a very good model of society, but it is a model. The same sort of thing happens everywhere. I mean, you look at music. My wife is a pianist, and I have spent my life with musicians since I was very young. And well, you look at that. This sort of people who half a century ago will be teaching music at a high school somewhere at best, are now regarded as major stars. I mean, you compare the great pianists, great violinists of the past. And when I say of the past, I don't mean Paganini or Rubinstein. I'm talking 50 years ago, let's say, for the sake of argument. I mean, it's the same thing. Everything has been reduced to crass commercialism, and I know it sounds as if I'm making socialist noises, but I'm not. I mean, commercialism has its place.
No, it's a stupid commercialism. I just wanted to give you a little example that I was seeing all the riots that we had here in New York, thankfully not in our backyard or front yard, but in the city, and all this looting. And I have this setup. I don't have a cable, so I use my Apple TV. I watch Fox News, naturally, since I'm that kind of person, that bad guy. I watch...
You have to be careful how you pronounce it.
Fox News?
Fox.
Fox.
Anyway,
It's an interesting moment when Putin and Trump are standing on the stage. There's a recording that I don't know if you've seen it on TV. They were standing side by side. It was the lectern, and Putin talks in Russian. Said, "So это факты," says Putin, and Trump startled a little bit, taken aback. What is he talking about? Факты. So yeah, Fox News. So I see the footage of the riots. They show like live reports as they're running from store to store, breaking windows, and more or less so organized, looting them. And it's one of the first cartoons that showed up was kind of Martin Luther King. So that was the first response on the free internet.
I wish I'd thought of that.
Yeah, it's kind of on the surface. Once you read it, you understand. But it was interesting because a lot of commercials, for quite some time, they try to become niche commercials, and they try to appeal to, say, black population, as they insist to be called, the blacks of America. And you see those people running around, and when you see this, and then there is a cut to a commercial, and you see a close-up of a person as if they're looking into your living room through the 65-inch television set in high definition, you get an impression. I said I was getting an impression like Donald Trump when Putin said "fuck it." Then that just somebody's running outside the house and just look into your window. Same people who are looting and breaking things, they're looking into your window and they're in your room.
They are.
There was the kind of the message that electronic means of communication. Inadvertently, but understandably, cobbled together to be delivered, and that's impossible to, because you see everything is, there is the saying when you add a teaspoon of dreck into a barrel of honey, what do you get? A barrel of dreck. That's what it is. So once you add a spoonful of politics into everything, it's things that you know is bad. You know it's bad. When you think about it, nobody lives by the rules that they want us to live by. None of the people who are running those things, they don't apply this to their own lives. They do as I say, not as I do. And
but everything in life is politicized these days. Politics has penetrated areas that were not designed for politics at all. Art, definitely.
Humor is my biggest concern. Art, I don't kind of art that I like more and more is kind of created. It's been demolished. It's been picked together and put together as Parthenon, as other things. So that will be Palmyra. The Russians destroyed it. ISIS destroyed it. It's been destroyed a number of times before that.
Parthenon was created a rather long time ago.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is that the world is nowadays rolled this way that you go to study, you think you're an artist. My wife's an artist, and I kind of know what.
A very talented one too, if I may add.
You're a lucky owner of one of her paintings.
Two, actually.
Yeah, exactly right. So you see, and people go there, and as they go to study film, they study Fellini and Antonioni, and not Griffith, of course, DW, but they study good stuff. And when they go to become an artist, they study the Impressionists, they study the Michelangelos, they study Leonardo's, Raphael's, etc., and they come out of it. And what do they see? What is popular? What is there to be sold? What they would, the creativity has been awoken by all those geniuses of the past who operated in totally different. You cannot even call it market, although they were very good businessmen. Most of them, they had their own schools, they had their own workshops. I mean, all those things that people don't take into account usually. They love to talk about the geniuses who created single-handedly things of beauty, and that was basically not Raphael most of the time, but Leonardo and Michelangelo. They were really heroes of Renaissance, and some others, lesser artists that are not in the forefront or maybe not lesser even. They're just not in the forefront of discussion. So I'm saying that the market went in a wholly different direction, and those people, those artists, they were creating something for out of their religiosity, out of their Christian values, out of their. I mean, the even the sheikhs of Araby cannot afford the level of mastery and craft that was demonstrated out of sheer religious feeling, like in Alhambra and places like that. It's kind of not replicable at all, and it's a great tragedy. And it's hard to think. I mean, we of course cannot know what's going to be next move in human progress, for lack of a better word, but what could be appealing to people in a situation like this? What to tell to the young
Well,
ones?
I'm not a great believer in progress,
I know, but I'm
actually.
calling progress the general movement from what you think your yesterday was not as good. Let's make today better than yesterday. That's
But
my.
that's not my point. Is that's not happening. It's happening in the physical life of the world. I mean, we live longer. We live by and large without pain, and everything is convenient and comfortable and all that. Uh, but in things that really matter, things of the spirit, I mean, I see a definite regress rather than progress. I mean, it's we're reverting to the pre-Christian past, but without Praxiteles or Pericles or Aristotle or Plato. I mean, it's just sheer paganism with new idols popped at the top of totem poles, and everybody is supposed to genuflect when passing by, as you know, for like Black Lives Matter, this
Yeah.
obscene gesture of going down on the knee. I mean, when people start going down on one knee before too long, the whole civilization will go down on both.
Yeah.
And and
And I think Joe Biden, judging by the polls that are popularized here, if he just lays down on the bed, he would just have the 100% of electorate the way they present him. He doesn't have to move a finger. The less he speaks, the less gaffes he's having, and that's just.
well, it's
Please continue.
but that's the nature of the nature of the world. I mean, you know, some of the people who, again, I'm not even comparing to the really old times, the really aristocratic times, but comparing to the 19th century. I mean, which modern politician in any Western country would have had a successful political career, let's say, in an England of Queen Victoria's time? I mean, it's just a totally different human caliber. I mean, somebody like Joe Biden in the America of let's say of the 1870s, 1890s, wouldn't have been invented the proverbial dog catcher. You know,
Yeah, that's a good. He was unable to even to sell snake oil at the fair.
but well, yes, but you see, that's the nature of modern politics, and thanks largely to those wonderfully quick and easy communications, the kind of negative processes, destructive processes that used to take 50 years now take 5 minutes.
That's right.
You know, and that's the benefit of technology, like, which is why we said humor. What really is impossible these days is satire, because reality outpaces satire by a huge margin. I mean,
No, it's also the cowardly nature of the media that is supported by advertising, and there's no vision. Like in the olden times, as I read, I was not alive then, but when NBC vice president would travel to Catskills to hear a comedian and give him a show, like what happened to Caesar and his brilliant career in early American television. It's today. It's just the more outrageous, the better. I don't see much funny stuff. I mean, I find because there are archives and recordings and YouTube and this and that, but I know it exists, and I want everybody to go. Unfortunately, back to the past and thank the technology that preserved all those things. I was listening to your lecture the other day about the modernism and postmodernism, and one of the things you kind of opened my eyes about was all those remarkable and eye-catching chimeras and other characters that sit on the Gothic cathedrals and churches.
Gargoyles.
Gargoyles, yes, but there are also very strange creatures. I remember one church in the rural Spain that is absolutely covered with obscene figures, sex, like Kama Sutra type of deal, without glorifying it, but it kind of looks nasty. And you mentioned that this is something that, and it's on the outside. You don't have to enter the church. You don't have to come to a mass. You don't have to be there on any special occasion. You pass it by and you see those figures, and you can bring your kids, whatever, just to take a look at it. And you mentioned that those are the
Exercise spirits.
exercise spirits, exactly. Because I looked at it, and the best explanation I could come up with for myself, I mean, not come up with, but came across for myself, was that it was just like a marketing of prehistoric marketing just to bring people to the
But
church.
they showed sculptures of saints, they showed gargoyles, and
Yeah.
they showed those weird creatures. And so essentially, as I put it in that lecture, I think if the Greek temple was the whole book, the facade of a Gothic cathedral is only the table of contents. If it tells you what you're going to find, if you actually do go to mass, and if you do hear the message, because they will explain
Hmm.
what sanctified the saints and what turned those spirits into evil spirits. But also in the past, strangely enough, they were a great deal less puritanical in some ways than we are now. For example, my wife comes from Exeter, which is in Devon,
Hmm.
and it has a marvelous cathedral, which was a
Yeah,
normal
yeah, yeah, I know.
a normal Norman Gothic cathedral, and there's a statue of St. Peter over the main portal, quite high up,
Hmm.
and it's a full frontal nudity type of statue. I mean, he's completely naked, and I mean, you wouldn't expect that in the church, but obviously, in some ways, they were less puritanical than we're now.
Was it a British sculptor, or was done by some
It was done by the Normans. I mean,
Normans? Okay,
most British cathedrals were actually built by the French.
right.
For example,
Yeah.
the same team that built the Sens Cathedral in Burgundy that moved on to
Mhm.
England and built Canterbury. So, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, but also in Gothic cathedrals, what's amazing is that those masons actually like to play little jokes.
Absolutely.
You know, you look at the capitals and all those columns, and then they're little faces carved out of stone, and they're obviously people. Those masons knew, or themselves maybe, or their patrons or whatever. It's quite it's quite fascinating. I mean, but again, looking at those cathedrals and looking at the churches built in our time, one finds the idea of progress rather dubious.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely. Interestingly, if I may say, that's my favorite bit. I said it. I don't know. No one heard it when I said it first and second and third time. But the thing is that the word Renaissance is a much later invention. It was like 100 years away from the lives of artists associated with Renaissance. And I kind of asked myself, and with the blessed help of Google search engine, I found the answer to the question: how did they call their new style when they were creating it? How would um, um, what's his face? Some the Duke Florence of Toscana would come and say, "Do me this style, whatever what you want to call it, this style that's so popular now. What's the name for it?" And that the word that they used was al antico. Al antico was as the old times, the antique way, the old way, ancient style. So this is what they meant, and this was actually that's why some people call Renaissance very reactionary in terms of their inspiration and the visuals. But they are so powerful, of course, they kind of just use the sheer brute force to make people admire it. That I mean, that's one of the things, and they were all competing not with the future like today's artists. I think that's one of the mistakes of today's ways of art. They try to see what will come next. They were looking those people during the history of before the 19th century probably. They were looking back, and they were competing with Phidias. They were competing with other masters that they knew, whose work they admired. And that was, I think, one of the reasons why their art is in the same book. I mean, what we see today, what we create today, probably will not be in the same book as the things we
Well,
admire.
well, if you talk specifically about architecture and plastic arts, then of course you're right. But in a weird sort of way, modernity, which has practically destroyed, in my view, architecture, has been much kinder to music, and music has suffered a much smaller amount of attrition.
Hmm.
And for example, if you look at the 20th century, I mean, great music was written throughout the 20th century. I mean, you could easily name, 20 great composers who they worked in a new idiom, and their musical language had changed, but their music still conveyed the essence of our civilization. I mean, if you look today, for example, actually, my good friend, but probably the best composer currently active, James Macmillan. Uh, James writes passions. He like Bach. He writes cantatas. He writes oratorios, symphonies, and all that. But he writes atonal music, and which is astounding. But that proves the point that I always make, that in the West, unlike, for example, by the West, I mean in the Christian West, unlike, for example, in Athens and in Hellenic times, what matters is the content, not so much the form. And the content determines the form, but the content can be expressed in any form, provided that the content is there. If you look at what Plato and Aristotle wrote about aesthetics, they clearly equated the beauty of form with morality and with goodness, which is why all those.
Yeah, but it's hard to convey the idea of goodness through the ugliness. That's the idea probably of the
I'm
how they
not
call it,
suggesting,
the
but
cathedral, Notre
but their
Dame.
beauty is skin deep. I keep making this point. If you look at Venus de Milo, for example, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a gorgeous sculpture, but what kind of a person was she? You just don't have an idea. But
No, but
if you
it's not
look,
an idea of a person. I mean, until the Roman
exactly,
sculptors, they did not bother with the personal traits or.
they didn't bother with the personal traits because the idea of a person was alien to them. They were in pursuit of abstract ideals. Whereas if you look, let's say, at the
Although, it's interesting. I'm sorry. I just thought that, I mean, it kind of fits the conversation, otherwise I would bring it up and interrupt you. But there are sculptures like this famous boxer, the bronze sculpture. Remember this boxer sitting in, I think it's in the Capitol Museum in Rome. And there is also this fantastic charioteer in Delphi, the young man with the eyes wide open. And it's the thing is that I I have to remind you that most of the things that we look at, they are later marble copies of the original bronzes, right? And the those what's called in Russian a хитроумный Greek, cunning Greek, right? Greek. They did it because the Romans loved and the Etruscans loved the Greek sculptures, so they started producing them out of marble. But if you look at this boxer, it's very personable. It's a real person. I don't know about the portrait part, but you really kind of it's a book in a form of a sculpture. 'Cause even his scars, even his wounds are accentuated with a different kind of metal. It's almost like a jewelry if you look at the details of how he's made. And of course, most of the bronzes they were melted and turned into doorknobs and whatnot. They kind of seek the way to whip themselves into a foam, lather rather, and this big thing was Russian piana and all kinds of similar substance in English because there's no so many names for it. But the reaction to humor is 9 out of 10 is people get insulted or fake insults, being insulted. So that's the death of humor, I must say.
It's funny that you mentioned that there are many words for the English words for the Russian piano, but that's because the English vocabulary is roughly 3 times larger than Russian.
Yeah,
English
so.
is by far the greatest vocabulary of all European languages, which is quite amazing because in one of my pieces, I have a lot of French readers in English, of course, but in one of my pieces, I made a point of drawing a very clear distinction between freedom and liberty in English, and my French readers couldn't understand what I was talking about because in French, of course, it's the same word, and the many examples like that where the very rational English mind fractures every concept so minutely that each little fragment needs
Sasha, you're breaking off.
Own,
Can you
needs its own.
You broke off when you started with the difference between French liberty and understanding in France. Can we have this again?
What I was saying is, well, I was making a point in my pieces that there's a huge difference between freedom and liberty in English. The first being mostly an inner spiritual concept, and the second being more physical. And we don't talk about liberty of speech. We talk about freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. But the French couldn't, because in France it's one word. It's the same word, la liberté, which is and say, what's the difference? It's like. There was this old sketch by an English comedian. God, I think it was Monty Python. It was about a chap who was reading the lyrics of the song "You say tomato, I say tomato." Right? He's an Englishman. He's reading those lyrics and says, it says, "I say tomato, you say tomato. I say potato, you say potato." It's like that. Both French and Russian, I think, are much better suited to, to poetic expression rather than philosophical, especially Russian. I mean, as you know, in Russian, you can convey a very broad range of emotions using different affixes, prefixes, suffixes, and
Yes,
all
that's
that.
right.
Which is why, actually, but also Russian words rhyme in a much more interesting fashion because English words rhyme usually in a very trivial way. I mean, you can rhyme boat and coat all you want, but you won't get an interesting reaction. There's no such thing as a root rhyme in
Mm-hmm.
English,
Mm-hmm.
which is why actually you find that in English to write great verse or very good verse, one has to be practically a genius. Whereas
That's good.
In Russian, some very very good
Mm-hmm.
verse has been written by people of rather modest talents. But when it comes to the essay, that is a quintessentially English art,
Mm-hmm.
really. And the English language is suited to that genre better than any other, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
Which is
There's one
fine.
fantastic. You of course know the an evening of Russian poetry by Nabokov. This poem of his, where he described the lecture. You remember that? It's a
Not,
fantastic excursion into the music of the language and the perception of Russian and English. And also, I was thinking as you were talking about the freedom and liberty, and both words are so kind of important today. I mean, I'm not being political. It's just something that makes people think about what it is. And do we feel it every day? Do we fight for it as we read in the books other people doing? Um, but in Russia, there is also voля and there's svoboda, right?
absolutely. Absolutely, which is very interesting because the Russians, by and large, understand the freedom as vola. And vola, of course, is etymologically related to the English word will,
That's right.
or to originally to Latin, of course. So to Russian, freedom is the ability to do as he will, to do whatever he wants to do, which is not the English way. When the it's quite interesting. The link between the national mentality and the national language is much more intricate than we realize. For example, uh, a perfectly good Russian sentence can have no verb at all. I mean, the key part of speech in the Russian language is the noun, the adjective, and the adverb, whereas the entire English language revolves around the verb, which is an action word.
That's right.
But uh, but uh, but that's fascinating because it's a reflection on the national character, obviously, because the English are very pragmatic
No.
uh,
Also,
people of action, whereas the Russians tend to contemplate things and then do nothing in the end. You know,
yeah, it's kind of a predictor that a prediction nobody's listening to.
it's quite fascinating how that works. And when I used to have students, when I taught English literature in particular, I always told them make sure that you construct your sentence around a verb, not around a noun, and certainly not around an adjective. And if you can get rid of adjectives and modifiers in general, just do so, because
Mm.
they're very precise and very evocative English verbs and nouns that don't require modifiers. But that is not a difference between two languages. It's the difference between two nations, really, between two peoples. It's quite fascinating, this excursion into psycholinguistics.
Yeah, and it was quite aptly captured, I think, by who said it? Lomonosov, right? In Russian, they love this quote of his, or maybe it was some translation from somewhere else, where he said that the Spanish is good to talk to God, and what else was there? He was trying to praise the Russian language, actually, and the French is to talk to ladies, or uh, I have to kind of caught myself by surprise by remembering all this. But he said the Russian language combines all of the above, saying that it's a specific function for every language. Like German is good to talk to the troops and this and that. But
Well, English is clearly the language of the essay. I mean, a language ideally suited to that genre, be that a philosophical essay, but mostly political or economic. The English have produced very few pure philosophers. The English talent is naturally expressed through applied philosophy, political or economic, or something like that. But as I say, I always tell people who talk about progress, I always invite them to compare Plato and Aristotle with today's professors of theology, of philosophy at Oxford or Cambridge, and said, well, how do you think they stack up?
mm-hmm.
You know, so.
Sasha, my proposal as of right now is to stop the episode 1 and announce the episode 2, which will be dedicated to the various forms of hucksterism and opportunism that you have witnessed in British life and I've witnessed in American life. Opportunism, in old Soviet sense, opportunism.
Meaning what in this case?
Meaning in this case, trying to seize the opportunity the way. So you worked in advertising. How would the advertising business seize upon the trends and political winds? And I must say, I mean, what I had in the back of my mind when I was trying to verbalize it was, I met a number of people from Cambridge and Oxford, and I was amazed of their socialist views. And it sort of became, for me, a major turnoff, I must say. I grew up as an Anglophile, and my mother is an English teacher, and she kind of started me on the language, and I got my own interest in various things written not in Russian but in English. And then I came across those people that are so deeply socialist, so deeply communist, so deeply turned off by everything capitalist. And it was stunning to me. So that is something that I think that could be interesting to talk about next time. What do you think?
People are really socialist. They just think they should be socialist. They don't understand those things at all. Like, for example, I wish I had £10 for every time I heard from people that Marxism is wonderful in theory, but it hasn't really worked in practice because the Soviets perverted it.
That was Marx's plan, to have £10 for every time you would hear this.
Great ideas, but poor realization. And I would say, well, what have you actually read by Marx? Nothing. I said, okay, so which ideas do you think are good in theory? I said, for example, would you like the idea of the state taking all children out of their families and raising them as its own wards, for example? Would you like total confiscation of all property, not just means of production, but of everything? I said, no. I said, would you like to have concentration camps, for example, which Marx and Engels called special guarded places? I said, no. I said, so which ideas are we talking about? I said, oh, well, equality and charity. I said, well, that's not Marxism. That's Christianity. I mean, that's the Bible. Marxism is not about that at all. It's the world is in a dangerous place right now, and all those people who you're talking about, those Oxbridge intellectuals, now teach somebody else. They raise the next generation, and the immunity that the West has developed so carefully over many centuries against total collapse is wearing off, in my view, largely under the influence of those kind of ideas.
Yeah. We need a benevolent monarch.
Uh,
But
we
we
need a
won't get him.
balance.
We're
We
not
need a,
getting him.
well, from Plato and Aristotle, it has been known that the last thing you need is a single form of power, a single form of government. That the best government is synthetic. And Plato wrote about that, Aristotle wrote about that, and everybody from Montesquieu, Edmund Burke, anybody you care to name, it's just known.
Yeah.
And ideally, that form of government existed in England in the 19th century, where there was the executive power of the king governing through the cabinet, and there was the elected power of the commons, which was the democratic element of the government, and then there was the unelected House of Lords, so mitigating between the two, making sure that the seesaw didn't swing too far to either end. And that has been destroyed in England, and that has been destroyed everywhere. Everywhere we now have this democracy run right with absolutely no restrictions and unchecked, and that has a knock-on effect on everything, including the type of people who get into politics, because now
That's
the
right.
only people who get into politics are out and out demagogues who know how to swing blocks of votes, and who have really not equipped for government.
I had a conversation with a very nice, very charming man who was in politics. Then he left for a few years, and he's the first Russian speaking politician. He's a little bit older than myself, and he was in New York. He was an assemblyman. Of course, he's a Democrat, and he explained to me. We spent some time on the phone, and it was a pleasure to listen to him and lay out the facts that as he sees them and the politics. And we really don't kind of really get into all that nuts and bolts of it. And he explained to me that everybody should register Democrat, and then see to it that they would vote. They go to vote for the most conservative Democrat, and that's the only way to, because in our American primaries you can choose the most conservative person, say, if you're inclined so, and that would prevent the uber lefties to come to power. But
Yes.
in his book, I mean, it looks very logical, very kind of practical, pragmatic, realpolitik. But in reality, things don't happen this way at all, because there are people
Mainly
who are
because there are
more. Say again?
mainly because there are no conservative Democrats any longer. I mean, they used to exist, but they
That's
don't.
one thing, but the other thing is that Democrats are in power for so long, and so many people vote them into power. And why didn't they have anything reasonable so far? Why New York is what it is right now? So much in debt, so many things, so much waste of money and effort, and say. Anywhere in the United States, the average cost of a mile of a highway to be paved is $40,000. It's a lot of money. 1 mile, $40,000. Boom, done. In New York, it's $1 million.
Wow.
1 million. Imagine the possibilities. Imagine the reserves. If what can be saved, what can be rearranged.
But
And I may.
even when New York had a Republican governor, when I first, not governor, I mean mayor, Lindsay. When I first got to New York, Lindsay was mayor. He was a Republican, but he was to the left of most Democrats I
Yeah,
ever
New
met.
York Republicans are very. I mean, so this is a combination of the kind of long game and the task at hand, because you have to see the future. You have to kind of. Republicans are non-existent. It's not a very interesting subject, actually. I think for both of us, because we can talk about other things. But that's. that's kind of the future of where we're going now, where everybody's striving for one party system and nobody's willing to do a constructive dialogue, which I'm sure Plato and Aristotle had in mind when they brought up the idea of governing by consensus, governing by some social compact, because we entrust the government
There,
here to send the police whenever we call them, and it costs a lot of money. And now the police says, you know what, you don't like us, we won't come. You know, we know.
they didn't talk about government by consensus. They talked about government by people who are fit to govern, and of course. In Athens, for example, a very small percentage of Athenians actually were entitled to vote, and then a
Yeah,
smaller
ten
percentage,
percent. About 10% of the population were.
if that. The quorum was something like a couple of thousand people. Uh, they were not Democrats. Aristotle referred to democracy as a deviant constitution, for example, and they talked about a small democratic element in government, but
Mhm.
not a government by. As to social contract, that's a much later it's a 17th century invention. It comes from Hobbes and then Locke, and then it was developed
Yeah,
by the French
right, right.
in the 18th century. Rousseau wrote this Du Contrat Social, this famous book. And I'm always amazed. I say, if it's a contract, then it's a very odd one, because every contract I've ever seen has a clause providing for its termination. How can we terminate this contract if we're not satisfied that both sides are holding their end? That doesn't exist, which
That's right.
means that the only way to cancel the contract is by violence, by violent outburst, because there are no legal means of doing so. You can vote for Democrats or liberals or conservatives or Labour or whatever, but the real social contract that Rousseau was talking about is
Mhm.
so much greater than that, and it's a contract between the state and the populace. How do you cancel that? Where are the clauses? It's I think it's a very false view of the world. Actually, this whole thing. It's a real government should be naturally legitimate, and the only naturally legitimate government is the monarchy. But it should be offset by democratic elements, and that is exactly what Plato and Aristotle wrote about, more or
Yeah.
less.
I think that there are some ways that we could be. I'm just trying to do some technical stuff here, so you would be in the best possible light here. Hold on just a second. Okay. All right. Now, um, what I was trying to say is that there are certain things. There's the ability to vote their own benefits for the American and I think British Western powers in general. People who are in our Congress and in your Parliament, they are. They have the power to vote themselves a lot of stuff, a lot of swag, and that's the bad thing. And they are not term limited here, and that's a big problem too, because people become become some sort of dynasties. I'm not even talking about the Bushes or the Clintons attempted dynasty or Kennedy's, but even in the lower levels of government, there's a son of somebody is entitled to be there, and of course it comes from ancient tradition. But I think that in limiting those things, it lies the future if we're looking for success. There should be government on the merits, election on the merits, not on the
Yeah,
who knows who. It's kind
but
of
how do
wishful
you
thinking, of course.
how do you define merit? You see, uh, as Churchill wrote, he said the strongest argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. I mean, how can, in order for, well, people who vote effectively take part in government, and taking part in government requires tremendous qualifications.
Yeah, I'm talking about just one aspect. Of course, education is should be proper and focused on personal gains, say of a voter, of a voting bloc.
Education to begin with, to remain educational, it cannot be comprehensive. I mean, because the attempts to educate tens of millions of people the same way typically result in nobody being educated properly.
That's right.
It's again, if you look at the English educational system of my youth, it was strictly stratified. There were secondary modern schools for people who couldn't quite pass the 11 plus examinations, and those were good schools preparing people for practical life in trades. And then there were grammar schools, which were state schools, but they provided superb education. I know some of my good friends were grammar school boys who were brilliantly educated. And then there were, of course, public schools, which are private schools. They were strictly for the elite. But when they introduced comprehensive education in the 1960s, they eliminated grammar schools, and they sort of and everybody was now educated together, which devastating results. Because in the past, we had 25% of the people who were very well educated, and the rest were competent. Now nobody is well educated. They're practically a few thousand people here or there. But when the public is as ignorant and as comprehensively dumbed down as ours, I don't see how we can put our future in their hands, and how we can rely on them to decide who has merit and who doesn't. Like, for example, when we had those Brexit debates, I talked to a lot of people, and I wrote about it. People would write to me and said, we want to stay in the European Union because it would make it easier to travel, for example. I said, well, but the English have traveled in Europe for centuries. Why do you think the main street in Nice is called Promenade des Anglais? I mean,
Let's cook up something. A few words of hope for us lost savages.
Single malt Scotch whiskey.
Okay.
I find that to be the most uplifting thing in the world today.
Yeah. A lot of things are encoded into this sip by generations.
It's interesting that I've been buying the same brand of whiskey, Lafroig, since about 1975.
Yeah.
And at that time, or 74 even, at that time a bottle of Lafroig cost $7, I remember. I don't know what it costs now, but I imagine quite a bit
Could
more.
be about 70 by now.
Yeah, but apart from that, I can't think of too many uplifting things. I can't offer words of hope because I don't hold that much hope. I think you say things like this have happened in the past. You're absolutely right. They have happened in the past. And every civilization so far has collapsed. And it's extremely preposterous of us to believe that ours will be eternal. I mean,
but we're so young. We're so young compared to Rome when it collapsed, or the Greeks, or
not really. I mean, it depends. I don't know how you define our civilization, but Christendom sort of existed for about a millennium and a half, which is roughly the length of time that civilizations get at best. So from let's say the 5th century to the 19th, early 20th. No, I don't think our civilization is that young. I mean, we're practically senescent in historical terms, and one sees signs. One can sees the signs of tremendous decline. I mean, the same as in Rome. Dominant decadence, the slackening of the will, slackening of the spirit. People talk about the spirit of the Blitz in London. I mean, I wonder how today's Londoners would react if bombs started raining on London. I doubt they would show the same fortitude and the same good humor, as a matter of fact, as they did then. But I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect I'm not.
I had a wonderful time many moons ago, and at a farm who was at the time I was 600 years old, and it's in the south, Somerset area. And there was an evening when my wife and I we decided we took it upon ourselves to cook for the whole community of artists who were invited to spend time there. I was there as a husband. I wasn't there as an artist. My wife was. So we went, we shopped, we bought things, and Russian cuisine is interesting. But at the time, it was still Soviet Union was still kind of. I mean, we still consider Russian dishes was there done by Georgians, Armenians. We still kind of mix and match all those things. So we cooked, and what's for dessert? And one lady who we knew, and I stayed actually with in our cottage, not in this farm. But she said, "I will provide the dessert." So we cooked up a storm, and all the vegetarians were stealing meats and chicken, from my pot as I was cooking it, and coming to smell, and they sensed the same, use the same produce every day, but it was different in terms of timing and smelled differently with whatever we cooked up. And she brought about 5 or 6 puddings, and she said those were the puddings that were made in England during the war. And I used kind of course, not the most desperate scraps that people would use to make those puddings during the war, but I tried my best to recreate all those things. And to me, it was kind of a glimpse into what World War II was for other countries, because in the Soviet Union, people were brought up, and they're still brought up, as if nothing else, mattered. Only the suffering of the Soviets, which was, sorry to say, in a big part, self-inflicted by trying to collude with Hitler to just sick him on the Europeans. But that was something that it was very uplifting. This dessert. Speaking of nicer things in life, it was very kind of spiritual to me, and very reminding of the difficulties that you can overcome. Speaking like an official person on a television.
You can overcome any difficulties, provided the inner strength is still there, provided it hasn't been dissipated. That's my point. I mean, I'm not sure that today's lot are capable of self-sacrifice, for example.
Yeah, this slogan, which was used for so many purposes, that is why we fight. And whatever we fight in a way that is allotted to us. We don't. I don't own any weapon, and it's not the time for me to kind of call for arming for armed resurgence resistance, but in general, it's the idea of why we fight. That's the answer. One should discover for themselves. I think it's in my view, it's in your face, but a lot of people are lost while facing this simple question.
Well, well, exactly. I mean, in England, the traditional slogan was "God, King, and Country."
Yeah.
There's God to speak of, and people's lives any longer. The king has been reduced to basically window dressing and some kind of a figurehead, and the country is not even the same anymore. I mean, it's one wonders. I don't think people will be willing to die for political correctness, for example. I mean, they talk about it, but I'm not sure they'll be willing to die for it. And what else have we got?
Yeah.
Rail. I mean,
You know this. I think it's maybe anecdotal, but I read about it on the internet, so it could be true. That this famous thing that's going around, this meme, "Keep calm and carry on." If you've seen it on the tea mugs and the coffee mugs and the T-shirts and the twisted and turned, the story I read about was that there was a plan, like let's call it Plan X or Plan Z. What if the British Isles were conquered by the Nazis?
yes.
And there was a bunch of posters printed with these words: "Keep calm and carry on," and with the royal, how they call it, the emblem on top, the crown, the emblem of the Windsors, and they were supposed to be plastered all over England. Those posters, so people would look at it and realize that there is something to live for, and there is something to expect, and something to keep in mind, to be mindful of.
Britain, you can have a fairly accurate idea of how Britain would have fared under the Nazis, because part of Britain, of course, was occupied, the Channel Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and so on. And they were quite, I wouldn't say collaborationist, but certainly they were quite cooperative. And it's amazing to see the photographs of that time when you see a Lloyd's Bank and an SS officer in front of it. It's scary, really. But there was a model. I don't know if you know the Steinbeck novel, The Moon is Down, where he writes about a country occupied by the Nazis. Well, it's modeled on the Channel Islands, actually. You had that.
No, we have a Netflix series here, The Man in a High Tower or something like that. I couldn't watch it. I tried. It's basically a corny copy of other movies made before, and not the best ones.
But of course, in France, as you know, every little village has the Place de la Résistance, and the resistance in France was very trivial until the latter stages of the war. At the beginning, they were quite happy, and Maurice Chevalier was singing "Paris reste Paris," Paris remains Paris, and all that, and Jean-Paul Sartre was having his plays produced in the theater, and the French film industry, as you probably know, flourished under the Nazis in the 40s. Some of the great films were made at that time. I mean, it's a subject for a different time, for another time, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a big thing. It's a big thing to talk about. Sasha, I thank you so very much for your time and for your knowledge and for the wealth of language that you gifted us with. And it's
Well, thank
fantastic.
you for having me.
We'll do something else together in a very, very foreseeable future. And I send my hugs and love to you and Penelope.
And to you as well from us.
All right.
Bye.
Hope to see you one day.
Bye.
Bye bye.